Very conveniently right in front of me. Tell us who you are and what you are so we can get a context to your question, sir.
Hi, I'm Jack. I'm currently studying public health at ACU and doing a bit of placement work at the MFB. I found it very interesting, the discussion around men and men's role when it comes to this sort of diversity issue. And I know, Bob, you were talking about at the start, sort of generalisations of men's behaviour. My question is, how do you address this issue when dealing with backlash, particularly from men, and when men will disregard by saying things like, excuse me, saying things like, oh, not all men do this, and I don't do this, and I know men and all that.
Yeah, I mean, if I was to start up, if I was more social media savvy, I'd actually start up a hashtag which said, yes, all men. Because that response of, but not all men, is a way of disconnecting men from the broader structures of patriarchy that I believe all of us as men are complicit in. Yes, it's true that, of course, not all men are physically violent towards women. Not all men have physically raped and sexually assaulted women. But all of us as men, growing up and being socialised into a patriarchal society, have become complicit with the structures within which that violence and sexual assault actually happens. And there was some research done in New Zealand a few years ago where they actually interviewed men about whether or not they would talk to their best mate if they knew that he was being physically abusive and violent towards his partner. And the vast majority of men said that no, they wouldn't. And there's been similar work done in follow-up campaigns in Australia, that men who discover that their best mate, their best male friend, is being abusive and violent will not challenge him. And so so I say, yes, all men. All of us. None of us are innocent. None of us escape that. And in saying that, I know that some men are going to be defensive, angry, and I just take that on board. I mean, I just then think we need to then deal with it and address that. I think too often with men, we shy away from naming explicitly what it is we need to challenge. And so there is this view that to engage men, you really need to be very, very careful to not sort of say anything that will lead men to be defensive. And so you don't actually use language that addresses the issue. And still, even if you don't do that, men will get defensive. But I expect men's defensiveness, and then pedagogically, I engage with that defensiveness. If there's going to be any change in any members of privileged groups, they're going to be defensive, and that defensiveness needs to be engaged with. I recently conducted a literature review for Vic Health with two other colleagues on how to engage with backlash against gender equality initiatives. To start to look at what strategies organisations might use to actually engage with that sort of backlash. But I think you have to name the issues as you see them and to get to the heart of the problem and then expect the backlash and then deal with it.
Question from right here, madam.
Hi, my name's Jean Jacobson. I just was curious, Andrew, about whether you have any contact with other brigades and CFA units and whether they're doing the same kinds of spreading opportunities for operation in the fireground around that your unit is. And I had a follow-up question for Debra, which is, I noticed that the gender equality guidelines, the implementation is contingent on a funding source that you haven't secured yet. Is that correct? So, if you could talk about that later, that would be great too.
This is just quick and easy. Essentially, we were funded through NEMP to develop those GEM guidelines, which had about 350 emergency management personnel's ideas put into them. Year 2 was not funded, so I don't think anything was for Year 2. And that was about the dissemination, and essentially the need to disseminate them led to this conference.
So yeah, in relation to your first question, there is a program that's initiated through Loddon Mallee Valley. Maston Ranges Shire Council has promoted a program called Rural Challenge. It's about taking a conversation into brigades and into sports clubs around male behaviour, raising awareness for diversity, inclusiveness. I can give you some contact details. It's already run one cycle. It's just about to run another cycle during the winter season.
Fiona Sewell, and officially here in my work role, but also privileged to have been volunteering at CFA for 16 years, and from 2002 to 2012 as an operational firefighter. In 2009, I took on the role of the Community Safety Community Education Officer, and that was on the back of that being my background around community education and engagement anyway, so it was easy. What is very clear in that role is that some of the influences around gender roles in preparing and responding to disasters are very influenced at a community and a society level, and that despite having 10 years of fireground experience, community members, adult community members, are quite programmed to looking to an older male firefighter for credibility and authenticity in the learning that they're there to gather. In my role in those situations, I wasn't there to change society's views around gender. I was there to be an effective educator. So it worked for me to take on a default position of making sure that I did have those older male firefighters there, and that there was a range of personalities and genders for community members to connect with. I'm curious what the panel's view is on how that influences what's happening with preparedness, where we do have a degree of majority community educators are female, and although that's changing, a lot of the other male presenters are quite young, and in some ways they face similar credibility issues to a middle-aged mum like me. So I'm curious, did your research, or do you have views on whether having a female educator talking about the intimacies of family fire planning, is that having an influence on how ineffectively we're ending up with family planning actually coming to be?
Can I say something? I'll just say two things. One of them is, in doing some of our research, we heard people say there'll be generational change and soon people will look equally to women as men. But we heard that young men were coming into places like the MFB and they were fine for about the first year or two. And then the culture started to swing them, away from looking to women as equals within that place. I think that I understand what you're doing, being pragmatic, because we try and be really pragmatic, but essentially it is continuing that cycle of, if you're looking for authority, look for a man in a uniform somewhere and you've got it. So, I don't know.
and I think that, one of the ways patriarchy works is that men listen to men in ways that we don't listen to women. And it's a tension and dilemma, I know, in the work that I do in a range of other areas, that I'll be brought in to talk to men. Usually I only do that work with and alongside women, because one of the tensions is that, by coming forward as someone who engages with men, because men will listen to me as a man and they won't hear the same message from women, and a lot of what I'm saying is I'm very conscious that I'm simply reiterating what women have said before me so many times and so much more eloquently and better than I can say it, but men will still hear it from me in ways they won't hear it from women. So then there's a responsibility to ensure that if you are thrust into that role, and you do take that role on, to be very, very conscious of how you use that privilege and what you communicate, and look for opportunities to affirm the voices of the women.
Just going to add, in terms of the training that I've done with Rachel, in terms of the GAD-pod, when we've been talking about the impact of family and domestic violence post-disasters, I've seen firsthand, I've seen Rachel deliver a message and it kind of impacts on half the room, 3/4 of the room, I'll stand up and say the same thing, not as well, and you get a different response. And we have deliberately always delivered that training with a male and a female facilitating for that reason.
There is also quite a lot of evidence to show that the language that traditionally has been used by community education programs in emergency services is written by men for men. So the language is male tinted, and one of the things that we've been working on in New South Wales with the Royal Fire Service is to change that language. So who are we trying to communicate with and for what? So that kind of one message fits all is increasingly recognised as not being effective. And so what in New South Wales now tends to happen is there's one kind of broad message that goes out on news and across the radio, which is very kind of punchy and snappy. But when it comes down to boots on the ground going out talking to communities is much more targeted. And it's realising from some of the research that women are actually much more open to certain messages at certain times, where men are open to other messages at other times, and so being specific about that. So I think it's really important to not see it as a failure if you feel like you're not getting across to everyone. It's about being most effective with certain groups at certain times.
Our final question.
Hi, I'm Peter O'Donoghue, South Australian Country Fire Service. I've been thinking a lot about the discussion about inclusion and privilege, and thinking about who's in the room and who's on the stage. And I was just thinking, just because I'm an action-orientated person, the plenary this afternoon I see has a lot of senior people, and you see Craig Lapsley all the time in the uniform. Oh my God, it's Craig on the telly again. So where's the power, placed? And I'd like to propose that this afternoon's plenary that we take those people off the stage and we put some of the community up there and let the conversation go the other way. What do you think of that?
If I can comment, it's interesting. We did this at our last conference too. We get the men there who have the decision-making ability. The guys who can think, yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to make a change. I'm going to sign something, and it's going to change in my organisation. And that's men, and that's what we're trying to change. There's a couple of women on the panel, but they were really hard to get, and one of them's just new into her role too. But I hear what you're saying. We went through that, and then we thought, let's try and get some outcomes from the conference that might continue beyond.
And sometimes I think we're too polite at conferences, and we accept too much of the agenda that's handed down to us. And I think if enough people felt the same way you did and gave voice to that, you could transform and change the agenda.
But I think sometimes it also, having those white men in power on stage really exposes the problems. And I'm thinking back to 2012 when we had the first conference, and I won't name names, but there was a very senior person on stage who said some very outrageous comments about diversity and inclusivity, and was challenged on the spot and literally almost ran to his car at the end of it. But it was such a powerful moment.
Name names. Fine. I don't know if your motion has been carried, but there is an undercurrent of subversive people who tend to agree with it. I'm still in, right? Okay, good. Folks, please thank our panellists for their perspectives. Andrew, Debra, Bob, Christine. Amen. Quite so. I concur. It is lunchtime. But we're very keen to get your